All right, so I'm gonna have the pleasure of introducing the next speaker, Dr. Nori Murakami. He graduated medical school at SUNY Downstate in 2009 with myself. We played lots of basketball together and against each other. He's did residency at Montefiore in social medicine, fellowship in global health and clinical skills, and he's a doctoral student in the community health sciences at Downstate. He's the former executive director of Friends of Kisoro, which operates a psychiatric psychological support center for refugees from the Congo. He helped establish the Brooklyn Asylum Clinic, and he's going to speak to us about asylum medicine in Brooklyn. Thank you.
Thank you. Can you guys hear me okay? I don't know if this is the microphone that's working. So first off, I just wanted to say thank you for letting me speak. I've done this talk a little bit before, and so usually it's like an hour, and trying to condense it into half an hour has been a little bit of a challenge. So I'm going to try to present a little bit of information, but the most important thing today is I wanted to impress upon you the urgency we have in trying to recruit other physicians, particularly from downstate, to help out at the asylum clinic that we established a couple of years ago. And what this is essentially, it's a place where people who are seeking asylum, so refugees, can come and get what we call a medical affidavit, which is then used in their sort of asylum process. It's a part of their immigration package that greatly aids them in getting asylum status here in the United States. And that training is actually done in conjunction with Physicians for Our Human Rights. And this year in January was our first training. It's just a one-day training. And we get all different types of speakers who kind of work in this realm and sort of give you the type of knowledge and sort of initial training that you need to be able to do these medical affidavits. And this year we're going to be hosting one at Downstate again. And this will be, I think November 15th is our tentative date. So all of this is in great timing because I feel like this crowd here in particular is a very sort of social justice oriented, very progressive crowd. And I think these issues speak very closely to a lot of the residents and the faculty. So, so my talk is basically about sort of asylum medicine in Brooklyn. But I'm going to start with this. Sorry. I just press this? Okay.
Yeah, you can click either.
Okay. So I'm going to start with just this very basic depiction about sort of the journey that a refugee takes, whether it's a refugee from the Congo or the refugee from South America, or even for a matter, refugees from the United States elsewhere. We describe the journey of the refugee as being sort of multiphasic, but sort of schematically, it kind of takes this pattern. And where you encounter a refugee, it really depends on sort of the line of work you do and where you are. But for the most part, this pattern is something that's rather prolonged. Going from one stage to the next can take months to years sometimes. And more importantly, with each of these phases in their journey, they face very different sort of sets of barriers and trauma. And where we sort of encounter this the most here in Brooklyn is in this sort of final stage, which is where in the scenario that we sort of encounter here in Brooklyn is mostly people who are seeking asylum status. They're already in the United States, and they're trying to basically go through the judiciary process, the immigration process, which then allows them to resettle, to have permission to work, and then to access services as well. So sort of broadly, there are about 71 million people who are displaced worldwide. This is from our recent estimates from almost 2 years ago now. 41 to 42 million people are what we call internally displaced people. And these are people who have to flee from their homes for any number of reasons. whether it's because of war or conflict or any type of persecution, or it can be also for environmental reasons. But these are people, for the most part, who don't leave their country of origin. So this is still within their national borders. About 26 million people worldwide, in addition to being forced to flee from their home, usually for security reasons, have to also cross a national border. And this is the point at which they are technically referred to as refugees. And currently, as of our most recent estimates, about 3.5 million people are actively seeking asylum, whether they have already been displaced to another country or whether they are trapped at a border. So on average, and this is a harrowing sort of figure, which is only going every day, but every day 37,000 people are forced to flee from their homes. And I think just kind of the previous talk about experiencing homelessness, right now, I just came from Oregon 2 weeks ago. And there, because of the wildfires, about 5% of the population of Oregon has had to flee their home. And a significant proportion of those people are experiencing sort of prolonged or even permanent homelessness. So a refugee is a person who, these are sort of the international definitions. A refugee is a person who's been forced to flee from their country due to either conflict, persecution, war, or violence. What makes them unique is that they have both a well-founded fear of persecution, usually for things such as their race or religion, their ethnicity, their political opinion, or membership in any particular social group. And the other defining feature of a refugee is someone who has a well-founded fear that makes them unable to return back home, usually because of their safety or for the safety of their families. Asylum seekers are a subset of refugees who are in the process of trying to were present to a foreign country, usually at a port of entry, and who are seeking refugee status. So by international standards, especially after World War II, we have certain rights that we have all agreed to as an international community when it comes to refugees. So the first one is the principle of non-refoulement, which is that we don't forcibly return people back to their country if they have credible fear. The second is that people who are seeking a refugee status, such as asylum seekers, are all entitled to some form of legal protection. So that means access to employment, education for children, and things like social security. And the last, and this is the most important part, I think, that is often overlooked, is there is no such thing as entering illegally. And I think this is a term that often gets thrown around, in particular these days when the political climate is really trying to vilify both immigration and people who are seeking asylum. Contrary to popular belief, most of the refugees are actually hosted in the African continent or the Middle East. If you look at the top refugee hosting countries around the world, by far Turkey has the highest number of refugees, and this is mostly because of the Syrian conflict, followed by Pakistan and then Uganda. And Uganda, where I've had the privilege of working for a while now, a lot of their refugees over many decades have been coming from the DRC, particularly the eastern region, as well as South Sudan, where there's still ongoing displacement. However, the United States, and I think when we think of refugees, we sort of incorporate that a little bit into our national identity. But we have in the United States the largest resettlement programs. And since 1970s and really from the 1980s onward, we have resettled almost more than 3 million refugees in the United States. So what exactly does it mean to resettle? Well, in 1980, the United States revised their Immigration and Nationality Act, which was quite discriminatory up until that point. And they amended it to create the Refugee Act of the 1980s, which provided a much more uniform definition of refugees, and also started and raised the cap of how many people we can resettle into the United States. And finally, it also established within the Department of Health and Human Services 2 agencies. One is the Office of Refugee Affairs, and the second one was the Office of Refugee Resettlement. And both of those agencies are mostly there to ensure the well-being and the transition of families and individuals who've been resettled from other countries. And this is just a schematic of what they do. So some of the things that they provide, people are eligible for Medicaid if they are refugees. They are eligible for cash assistance. Children and families are eligible for social services, such as, in addition to school, things like language training, vocational training. In New York City, we have one of the biggest torture survivors program run through the Bellevue Hospital. It's the program for survivors of torture. But then also we have other forms of services. And the entire budget for that, for all the refugees who are then brought over to the United States and then are usually partnered with a volunteer organization such as Catholic World Services or IRC, the entire budget that the federal government, in terms of their assistance, it's really, really small. It's $470 million, which is a drop in the bucket. However, if you look at the rates of resettlement, this has been steadily declining. And it's not too surprising to see that in the last several years, that number has been further curtailed. This current administration has become quite averse to expanding or even curtailing a lot of the services that were available to the refugees and their families. Just so that you know, the majority of the refugees who are being resettled are coming from the African continent as well as Southeast Asia. And in New York State, if you look at, New York State is the 3rd highest in terms of accepting resettlement, refugee resettlement. If you look at the breakdown, New York City, there is not a lot of people who resettle here. It's usually in places like Rochester. But 33% of those who came to New York State were from the DRC. So this process that I've been describing to you is, this is known as the refugee resettlement process. And this is when, someone who is identified as a vulnerable person, usually at a refugee camp, any number of them from around the world, they are then extremely strictly vetted through the Department of Homeland Security and the State Department. And then once they clear all of those hurdles, then they are then referred to the United States through a resettlement program. Now, you're not going to encounter people who are going through that process because by the time they arrive, everything is already set up for them. Not to say that that journey and then that experience of being here is also not easy. You can imagine, if you've ever watched the documentary Lost Boys, it's about a group of children from Sudan who then moved to, I forget where in the Midwest. That transition, often alone, is incredibly difficult. However, much more difficult, I would say, are those refugees who come through sort of a different route. And this is sort of a schematic of what I'm trying to describe here. What I was talking about earlier, this resettlement program, is this top sort of pathway. But the majority of people that we're going to encounter are people who come through either by themselves or who have come into the United States, and after they come in here, whether with a visa or with an expired visa, are then trying to claim asylum status because of the persecution that they had experienced. This is known as affirmative asylum process. So those people who enter with a visa and then go to the USCIS to say, you know what, I can't go back, or my family has to come because we are being actively persecuted. The other sort of more commonly known scenario is similar to affirmative asylum process. These are for people who are fleeing persecution, who arrive at the border and say at the border, I'm leaving my country because we live in a place that the police does not, work to protect us, and let's say gangs are terrorizing our neighborhoods. I think a common sort of famous image of that is the famous the migrant caravan from a few years ago, where people walked, upwards of 1,100 miles from Honduras all the way up to the border of the United States. And during that time, the Trump administration really sort of politicized that with the images. They sent down the National Guards, and so these are people who I would say, are sort of what we call arriving asylum seekers. And the last sort of pathway here, and this is something we probably see a lot of here in New York City, are what we call defensive asylum processes. And these are for people who have come in, and then let's say even if they had a visa, that visa expires, and then they try to figure out if they can claim asylum status. So asylum seekers are given the same protection under the Refugee Act from 1980. The only difference here is that the burden of proof is on them. So they have a lot of additional barriers they have to overcome in order for them to be granted a stay. One of the big rules that's really difficult is they have something called a 1-year filing rule, which means that from the moment they came in, they have only up to a year to start that asylum process. Some asylum seekers have been living here for many, many years before they decide finally that they want to try to seek asylum. There's also something called a material support bar, which is, I won't go into it too much, but basically what you can see is there's a lot of different limitations, and of course they're not eligible for a lot of the services that should be made available to them. And the process of getting an asylum status is very, very prolonged. It takes on average up to several years from the moment that you file to the moment that you get an immigration date. And then the other issue that's hard to ignore is a lot of people, particularly those, for example, who arrived at the border now, they are, rather than being allowed to enter the country and being given a date for their immigration hearing, they are being detained. And that was really done, I think, for the most part, as a deterrent, and also to purposefully perhaps make it seem like there was some sort of criminal intent behind asylum seeking, which is obviously completely wrong and bizarre. But these are images from these detention centers that you may have seen. And if you look at them, they are essentially like a prison. And just so that you know, as of 2016, we don't have a lot of up-to-date information on asylum detention centers. But as of 2016, 44,000 people were being detained in these detention centers. And they are not given, they're still pending an immigration hearing date. They have done nothing wrong other than the fact that they tried to come into the country because they're seeking safety. And more sort of recently, there's been issues around family separation. A lot of the children were taken from the parents and then detained separately. And the other big issue with the detention centers is, just like the prison system, 60% or so of the immigration detention centers are privatized. And just FYI, it may seem like these detention centers are far away from us, but it turns out that, for example, there is one very close to us, right across the river. So all of this is being presented to you because there is something that we as physicians can do. In the asylum process, you as a physician can serve as someone called the expert witness. And what that person does is, in the immigration package, when the immigration judge hears the case, the job of the judge is to try to corroborate what the client is saying and to sort of verify how true it is. And sometimes that's a very difficult thing to do. You can have an expert witness, someone who's very knowledgeable about the country and sort of the political situation, and they can testify about sort of what kinds of conflicts are happening and how this pertains to this client. But the physician is often brought in as an expert witness because they can testify to the objective clinical evidence, particularly if they have been subjected to any form of torture or physical abuse. And unfortunately, for a lot of people who are being persecuted, whether for religious reasons or because of their sexual orientation, they have endured both psychological and physical abuse. And for those people who have been subjected to torture and violence, more often than not, there is some sort of physical scar or evidence behind it. And as a physician, what you can do in the medical affidavit is you can testify to how consistent those scars are. And any type of objective evidence that the judge sees usually is enough for them to then say, to make a decision to say, you know what, this person has been going through all of these things and has credible fear and therefore cannot return to the country. It turns out in New York State, for example, 90% of those people, asylum seekers, who have a medical affidavit are granted asylum status. And this is almost 2.5 times the national average. So just to kind of speak to the importance of what these medical affidavits can do. Medical affidavits are very straightforward. You basically obtain facts and you try to correlate it to the experience that the asylum seeker had. Basically what you do is you perform a focused history, physical exam, and a psychological evaluation. And then you just you testify as to whether that's consistent or not with what you see. We established a sort of asylum clinic here in conjunction with the Brooklyn Free Clinic. This was all done through the students, by the way. And they can't, because the bottleneck here for people getting their medical affidavits was they couldn't find enough physicians who would want to do this or who feel comfortable enough doing this. So they came up with a system that tries to make it as easy as possible for us physicians, both residents and attendings, to be able to do this. And basically they take the entire burden of, writing the affidavit, arranging the space, the interpreters needed, and liaising with the case manager or the person usually from the legal firm. And just so that when we volunteer to do this work, all we have to do is show up and do the interview and the physical exam. And this is kind of what a sample affidavit looks like. It's this rubber stamp template that you work off of. And again, the medical student who's in there with you during the interview will be the person who documents everything, and they will be the first one to create the draft of the medical affidavit. And then once it's written, the resident or the attendings will then review it, and then there'll be a back and forth with the lawyers. And then once it's all finalized and ready to be part of the immigration package, they will just notarize it. Basic competencies that you need, basically you have some basic knowledge of sort of the physical and the mental health consequences of torture. And that will be all covered in the training. Basically, we need people who have, who understand sort of the delicacy of eliciting this type of torture narrative, which is, of course, trauma-informed approaches is the mainstay here. These are just some examples of the most common things that you would sort of examine. Lacerations of the skin, whether it's from blunt trauma, the way it healed, is it correlate with the way they were hit, with what object? Things like incisions, burns are very, very common, particularly with things like cigarettes. And then, of course, knowing sort of the psychological sequelae, right? Do they have things in their history that could fit the criteria, for example, for PTSD, which is one of the most common psychological sequelae, which also then gets put into the medical affidavit. So, common barriers that keep people from doing these medical affidavits. Some people say, well, I don't have enough time or space to do the medical interviews. So we have set up here, we have an entire group of students who coordinate all of these, and we use the Brooklyn Free Clinic, that space, to be able to conduct some of these interviews. Usually it takes about an hour and a half, not very long. Some people feel a little bit like they don't have the experience or the time to do this. Again, most of the heavy lifting when it comes to drafting the medical affidavit is done by the student. And again, there's a lawyer, and there's a lot of back and forth so that the languaging is consistent. Some people feel nervous about doing this without a lot of training, which is why we're going to be hosting our second training on November 15th. Because of COVID, we're likely going to be doing it via Zoom, which means you can do it from the comfort of your home. So the other question I often get is, can residents do this? And absolutely, residents can do this. Usually we have them paired with an attending, because on the affidavit, you do have to state that you have a state license. But we want residents actually to do this because a few years from now, the residents will be attendings and they'll be able to continue doing this wherever they are. So just key take-home points. Asylum seekers and refugees are entitled to protection under international and US law. Our current law protects them. And I think sometimes it's important to remember that because it does get politicized quite a bit. We all play a key role, if we want to, in that process. It has a huge impact. And, you know, we have our first asylum medicine clinic here in Brooklyn, and we would love for you guys to get involved. You know, we ask if you get the training, just do the training first, and then you don't have to commit until you're ready to. And when you're ready to, if you can even just do one a year, that would be huge. And so again, consider joining us. And again, thank you for your time. And if you have any questions.
Can you just give out your contact info or contact info?
Yes.
Okay.
This is my contact information. We will be sending out a reminder as we get closer to November 15th. It will usually be through the Downstate has a chapter for Physicians for Human Rights, and they're the ones who are usually organizing all this. Yes.
Do you have a flyer, maybe listing the Downstate Clinic, the Bellevue, the Cornell, the Einstein, like all the places where people can go get?
I don't have a flyer on me right now, but there is. So the Physicians for Human Rights, there are two organizations in New York City, or actually nationwide, that kind of focus on this network of providers who do these medical affidavits, as well as sort of working with these clinics. A lot of them are medical student run. So there are, you know, this isn't the first in New York City. There's one at Mount Sinai. There's one, I think, at Columbia. I know Montefiore has one as well. But Physicians for Human Rights is the one that, if you go to their website, they will have links to all their sort of clinics and resources and trainings too. We do multiple trainings, not just here, but all over the city and all over the country. The other organization is Health Rights International, and they've been doing this as well. So they both do trainings, and they're both very similar. And depending on the time of the year, you know, you can find one training closer to you. Okay, I think that's it. Yes?
If you're a resident, do you have to find an attending to work with, or do you just organize?
They will set that up for you. So here at Downstate, we have now, because we did one iteration of the training, we have a lot more physicians, both from the Department of Psychiatry and in the emergency medicine faculty. Dr. Christina Bloom has done this before. Dr. Grant is a neurology attending. He does it too. But as long as if you go through the training and you want to do it, our student coordinators will both, you know, set up the resident and the attending for you, so you don't have to find a different attending to do it with you. Okay. Thank you guys. I appreciate it.